Good morning. How are you?
I'm great. How are you? So good to
I'm
see
great.
you.
I'm so glad to see you outside of Cafe Lux.
I know, right? We got to
Exactly.
get away from there to do any work, actually.
That's true. Actually, it's such a social zone, and who knew? I have to say, so it's always funny to me. Like I usually avoid it, as we discussed, and what an opportunity to have met you. And I was just think it's interesting for me what I attract into my life, being the direct, cheeky person that I am. I knew you needed me in in your life.
Direct, cheeky, new? You know, that's not, that doesn't track. That doesn't seem on brand. I feel like,
Completely
am I
on
talking to a different Michelle? I don't know what's going on.
exactly, exactly. Well, it provided my cheekiness provided me the opportunity to get your last book of The Color of Everything that you had in your hand for that day, because we
That
know that
day.
there are several out there that people could actually buy. But it also afforded me the opportunity to sit and really get to know you. And it truly is an honor. I mean, the
Mhm.
more I dig deeper into who you are, which all your accolades are one thing, but really your presence says it all.
Thank you. That actually makes me a little bit emotional. I needed that this morning. You know,
Oh,
I woke up this morning kind of, you know how it is, like there's so much veneer or facade or like there's so much external stuff and I think one of the things that we forget is so often when we're especially on social media and things we've talked about this like we compare ourselves externally to these very curated um views into people's lives. And you know, this morning was one of those mornings where, you know, I woke up at 5 with my partner, my girlfriend, and we sort of like struggle through our morning together. You know, there's the nitpicky shit of life that we have to like navigate as a little family. And it, you know, so thank you for saying that. That means the world to me.
yeah. I think, honestly, like whenever we're able to truly be present with one another, and this is an opportunity for that, right? Uh, it's rare. And
Yeah.
honestly, like when we deal daily in the nitpicky of life with our families and our partners, we don't always get this opportunity.
Mm-mm.
And that day that we met up for coffee, separate from other times at Lux, actually was a gift because I felt like I really saw you,
Yeah.
and well, I had read about you because, of course, my cheekiness was like, I don't even know who the fuck this guy is. Like, like I
And
was
why
like,
would you?
you should be lucky to know me, Cory Richards.
And I am. I'm very lucky to
Exactly.
know you.
It's so true. And obviously the feeling's mutual. Like I didn't know what you even did for a living. And all I saw was sort of the shell of this person that seemed super cool. But when we delved in deeper that day, what was super cool for me even was your interest in wanting to understand the human person and
Mhm.
relationships. So
Yeah.
that's rare, to be honest with you. And not just personal growth wise. I mean, obviously you had your own journeys, right?
Hmm.
But like you really were like, well, what do you think makes men and women want to interact with each other and build longevity?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole, I mean, for me, obviously, and for those of people that don't know who I am, and I'm assuming that's most listening to this podcast, like m so much of what I've done comes through the lens of uh, you know, National Geographic photography and professional athlete and stuff like that. But the deeper journey and really what the book is about, which is sort of was the entree into our relationship and the conversation is about mental health. But my curiosity around mental health, as much as like diagnoses and psychopathology and all these things are really interesting to me. What's most interesting to me is exactly what you're talking about, which is the interplay between humans and the interplay between um, humans and themselves first and foremost, because that is our primary relationship, and then the interplay and the relationships we have externally and how what's going on inside of us uh, directs and informs those relationships and those interactions. And you know, we were having a conversation about specifically men and women that day. And it was, yeah, I mean, that's where my biggest curiosity is, because the mental health stuff is, it's great, but really it's just information that helps us understand why we're doing the things we're doing. And that's what
Exactly.
matters, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, if we're only looking internally and we don't look how we're actually using what we learn internally, if you're so fortunate that you truly want to know that, it
Yeah.
what really makes the difference is how we impact the greater world, right? And what
Right.
we do, like going back to what you do for a living, it does impact the greater good of the world. So I remember when we sat together initially, and you're like, I totally want you to interview me, but I really want you to read my book first. I mean, I don't want to tell you what to do, Michelle,
Yeah.
but
Right.
yet you
Right.
do because we
Yeah.
know you. And I remember looking at you a bit bewildered, like, oh, he's trying to control the process. But honestly, I think what we were talking about that day a lot was about adventuring, right? And
Yeah.
how our personalities serve us in those ways. And the mirroring that we have of one another, even though we're different ages and do different things for a living. But your book, The Color of Everything, and your suggestion for me to read it um, was a gift.
Oh.
It was honestly I started reading it, and then I actually transitioned quickly into your audiobook. And I have to say, I really liked the audiobook because I can hear you.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think it's such a personal story. I really love it when authors read their own books, even if
Me
they're
too.
fiction or whatever it happens to be. I think that because there's so much emotion that comes with the words. There's a way that it was written. There was a way that they heard it in their minds, and the way that when they were reading it out loud to themselves to try to nail the editing process. It's their voice. So for me, reading my book was super important. And also, my story specifically is so personal that um, I couldn't have imagined giving giving that process over to somebody else. It wouldn't have
Yeah.
made sense. And also, I think that ironically, or not ironically, maybe appropriately to that point, like, the highest reviews, like it's the highest reviewed on Audible
Oh,
because
interesting.
because I'm reading it. It's like
Yes.
4.8 stars there
Well,
instead
people
of.
can connect to you. Going back to what we're
Exactly.
talking about, it's a connection point, and just understanding uh, all parts of you, meaning like the fear and trepidation, the relationship with your father, but yet you still call upon him
Hmm.
in so many parts. It's like we all know that ringing of our parents in our head our entire
Hmm.
life, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, like for me, when I'm listening to you. Narrate it, the book being called The Color of Everything, it's a colorful rendition of your life,
Yeah. I
is
mean,
the
it
way
is.
I
It's
look at it. Yeah.
full of color. It's like, but how life, like memory's just weird. Memory's
Yes.
just weird because it's not tack sharp. And in fact, it's not even really designed to be tack sharp. It's very fallible. But
Mhm.
like I just remember life as like shards, like
Mm,
colorful splinters of of experience or relationships or moments that just sort of come together as this crazy mosaic.
mm.
And over time it creates an incredible, beautiful sort of picture of everything, but they're all just tiny little colorful pieces plastered on top of each other.
Yeah, it's like it's interesting because if we parlay that to your drive, right?
Hmm.
It feels like every little shard, because I remember you describing shard. It's actually, I remember it's in chapter 17. And
Love
uh,
it.
it's true. But believe it or not, I'm not lying when I say that it really had an impact on me. But when I hear you describe shards, I think of like puzzle pieces, right? And that
Hmm.
yet the picture's not complete.
Right, right. Well, it's never complete. It's never complete until that moment that you actually close your eyes at the end of life, or the
Mm,
lights go out. The
hmm.
pieces are always finding their way. And for me, the interesting thing, and so much of what writing and the process of writing this book was about is figuring out that some of the pieces at one point in life might fit here, but then at another point in life fit differently, or you have to change the shape of that puzzle piece altogether, or you have to
Mm,
throw it out, right?
mhm,
Because potentially in our stories and the stories that we tell, the narratives we create, the narratives we craft about ourselves, our families, the world we inhabit, the life we live, sometimes those puzzle pieces that seem to fit and they seem so important when we're younger, or they fit as a certain stage, all of a sudden, when you start to look back on it and you start to see how potentially, if you're using that analogy, putting that one piece right there in that shape has dramatically impacted every other piece around it.
mhm.
It's worthy of, at least for me, I think it's worthy of a curiosity, is like, well, wait a minute, is that, if that's, excuse my language, but if that's fucking up every other piece that's connected to it,
Totally.
is that how I want that to lay? And
Mhm.
is I think so often too, we think of our stories as immutable, as sort of like they're fixed, but they're really not,
I
you
love
know,
that you're
like,
saying this. That because I was going to say, like, can you rewrite your story? Can you redraw the painting? Or
mm-hmm.
is it really a redrawing, or is it really more of a shifting, or it's a reflection of, or adding another frame to the painting? I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's such a good question. I think, look, all history is revisionist history,
Yes.
you know, and the way I tend to think of it is there are there's data, which
Hmm.
is sort of the hard facts of existence. And I mean just facts. The floor, does not cradle my fall, ergo the floor is hard, right? That's the data. So we get data coming in, and then our minds, our consciousness just takes that data and it applies a narrative or a story to it, which then gives it meaning, which creates a belief, right?
Hmm.
And then the belief that we have starts to reinforce the story that we're telling about whatever it is. Now, there's that extends to the basic things like the floor is hard, don't fall down. That's,
Exactly.
the stove is hot, don't touch it. But then we also do this with everything that happens to us.
Hmm.
So, and then we create this, we create a narrative around an experience. This happened to me is already, you're already off to the races with a
Exactly.
story in your head. The facts are this happened to me already puts us in a back seat. It's
Totally.
already a place of victimhood. That doesn't mean that you're not a victim. It doesn't mean something terrible didn't happen in your life, but already you see how we start to build a structure, a narrative, and then
And
we start
honestly,
to
a patterning of
exactly,
accepting that that is an anticipation of what's going to happen instead of an
exactly.
openness.
Exactly. So that's exactly that. So the words we're starting to use to apply to our stories from the ground level are already layering in a framework of the meaning that we're going to apply and the belief that's going to come from that. And that's where it gets really interesting. So to your point, can you rewrite the story? Can you repaint it? You can repaint the story. You might not be able to, well, you can't repaint the facts, the data of the story,
Yep,
but your interpretation of it, you bet you can. And
exactly.
that's, I think, so deeply powerful. And that's
And
also not to
that's where
say
the
that, like,
growth is. The
that's
growth
where
is
the growth is.
actually in the repatterning, right? And in the
Exactly.
desire to want to change the story.
Exactly.
And
But a
that's what
lot of us,
you've literally done in your life. You've literally tried to repattern certain things. It doesn't mean that you don't fall back on stuff because
oh,
that's human nature.
yeah,
He's like,
yeah.
well, let me tell you about it.
Well, let me tell you about what I fall back on. But you're absolutely right. It's about the reframing. That is growth. This isn't to say also this isn't about toxic positivity and
No,
delusional thinking and sort
no.
of it's about re-examining, like, I mean, in the book, what I talk a lot about is re-examining the story of mental health.
Hmm.
People talk so often about breaking the stigma. And I think that's sort of, and I love that, but it's like, well, if you ask people to define what the stigma actually is, it gets hard for people.
Yeah.
The way I define that is there's a narrative of brokenness. So the
Mm,
whole point is breaking the story of broken. But in order to do that, you have to really walk back really, really far. I mean, and I'm talking deep into the roots of how we view mental health. And that's just one story, right? But the other thing about this is that when it comes to stories of mental health or victimization, um, being a victim is actually really comfortable. And it's important for a time, right? Because terrible shit happens. But then this whole idea of rewriting the story is stepping out of victimhood versus learning a narrative of your brokenness, your trauma, whatever it happens to be, and then staying stuck in that.
Well, we are what we say, right? And
Right.
and we are our own actions, and often, and every action has a reaction, right? And
Hmm.
realistically, most people want to stay there. And
It's
that's
comfortable.
why I was so excited about the opportunity to interview you, because I was like, wow, here's a person who truly owns himself, all parts of
Mm.
yourself, from childhood to adulthood, and is still not accepting where he's at. And
For
you've done a
better and
lot of shit,
worse.
like a lot of shit, you know?
Yeah.
And I think, like, when we talk about, when I think about your conditioning at a young
Mhm.
age, here you were, how old were you when you started being a climber or a mountaineer? Like, you were a kid.
I was tiny. So my parents were very big into the outdoors. I was born in Utah. We started skiing. I started skiing when I was 2. My brother, who's 2 years older, started skiing at the same time when he was 2. And then we started climbing at about 5 and 7, respectively. So I started climbing when I was 5 and he was 7. So yeah, I mean, talk about conditioning, right?
Exactly. And yet you still had to rewrite things in
Yeah.
your story, because your dad got to a certain point, correct?
Yeah.
So how
Yeah.
did your dad start to train you in the first place?
Well, so my dad, he was both my parents had been climbers, and my dad he grew up climbing with this group of guys called the Alpenbach in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I mean, he loved climbing, and some of those climbers that he was with in that time period became some of the best climbers of the day. And he chose a path of family and
Mhm.
marriage, and I think there's that old idea that children sort of fulfill their parents' dreams.
Totally.
And so I think both my brother and I stepped into that role for him. My brother was a career skier, and I stepped into the climbing path. And so I mean, what it
Was
looks
it
like when we're
conscious?
kids. What was that?
Was it conscious that you were doing that in some ways as a no?
No,
It's
I
just
mean,
the
I
love of
think we
what
were.
you did.
Yeah, I think it was just what we did as a family, and I think we were raised on these sort of stories of climbing and adventure, and that's what my dad read to us at night. After the kids' books were all put down, he started going into his mountain library and reading to us from these stories of like climbing these huge mountains in the Himalaya and these big adventure stories. So I think that, again, we're getting conditioned and in a very beautiful way at that time period. And then when we were little, we were backpacking, and he brought a small piece of rope and some webbing, and he made these little harnesses for us, and he just threw the rope over a boulder, and he taught us how to climb. And I mean, we're tiny. And then as we got better and better and better and grew a little bit, he started teaching us how to climb bigger things and then start leading bigger things, which is when you start climbing from the ground up with the rope attached to you, not from
Mhm.
above. But
Mhm.
so I mean, and that progression of skill and learning that really was accelerated until the time I was about 12 or 13 when my adolescence started to just sort of unravel, and I started to fall off yeah, it just went
Did you
sideways.
know at that point in time that you had bipolar, or when did you actually or did you think you were depressed? I mean, you describe in your book a lot about some of your early trials, like in high school, and you try a lot of different things in and out. And
Yeah.
were you aware, or did you think it was just sort of, I mean, it was a bit manic behavior, right? But was it conscious again?
Well, I mean, here's the thing. I look back on it, and this is where history gets sticky
Hmm.
because I look back on it with far more ownership than I ever wanted to have before. Yeah, I
Mm.
wanted it to be like unconscious and just sort of manic and off the rails. But I now I look back and I go, Cory, I think you were more aware than you were letting on.
Mm.
And maybe that's giving myself too much credit, but I certainly there was always a choice. There
Yeah,
was
of course.
always uh there was always agency in it, and I just didn't want to accept it.
Mm.
I as soon as I started learning about mental health and the things that I struggled with, including, first depression and then anxiety, and then I was put on Prozac when I was about 12, and went through a list of SSRIs. Before I was diagnosed bipolar. But as soon as I learned that there was something quote unquote wrong with me, um, I also
Which we know there's
started.
nothing wrong with you.
Right, exactly.
I'm a huge believer in there's nothing wrong with anyone.
Right.
It's just
Right.
who we are. It's actually part of what makes you fucking brilliant.
Well, that's the thing with data, right?
Yes.
That's the data is my brain functions in a specific way at
Hmm.
specific times. That's the data. The
Sometimes
story.
to your point about like patterning, people get stuck in it and then they're like, well, it's because I'm this way. It's not about that. It's about using that as information to apply it to help you move forward.
Exactly. That is, I mean, that's what I say in the last chapter. I say psychology is an invitation out of victimhood, not into it. But so often
Mm-hmm.
people use it as an invitation into victimhood. Hey, look, there's something wrong with me. Well, no, this is just how your brain functions.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how it impacts behavior. And the more you can engage with that and understand it, the more you can direct it. And
Mm-hmm.
that's not to say that you're almighty or all powerful, but certainly this idea of this oversensitivity to things right now, and this sort of coddling that we see, actually, I think is damaging, because I think it deepens the stigma around mental health. Because now what we're asking is, hey, there's something now we have to be really careful. Well, that's not breaking the story of broken. That's accommodating for um, that's sort of accommodating for people's sensitivities, which I don't think I don't I like the idea, but I don't think that that's ever possible, you know?
Yeah, I agree. And so when you say, I mean, I guess the question is like, how do you break the story of broken?
Yeah. You get really, really, really honest.
Mm.
And I think that's a process. I think it takes time. I don't think that it happens overnight. I think you get really, really curious about um,
Who you
your
are?
own actions.
Yeah.
And that's a hard journey. And honestly, it's not a journey everybody's going to take, right? Because as we've already said, that those labels, those ideas, those narratives of diagnoses and different psychopathology, they can be very comfortable because it helps us explain our what we're going through. Like, look at what's happening with ADHD right now,
Mm-hmm.
right? All of a sudden, everybody is ADHD. That may or may not be true. It's probably underdiagnosed,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't all that is information as to why the behaviors present the way they do and what's happening. That is
Well,
not to say that, oh, now that I know this, now I get to sort of hide behind it
well,
and use it as an
I
excuse.
think we're a microwave driven society, right? So we want a quick fix that we
Hmm.
can quickly heat up and
Hmm.
hopefully it's going to help us, right? And
Right.
what we keep learning is it is um it is something to help. Medication is something to help us, right?
Hmm.
But if we don't address the root cause, whether that be
Hmm.
trauma or, mitigate the behavior or try to mitigate the behavior, it's just going to keep repeating.
Right. Well, it's kind of like my friend, and I use this quote a lot, and I love her. Her name's Lauren Tell. She's a superstar therapist who does a lot of work in the psychedelic space, but she's like, well, it's like diagnosing sick fish in toxic water.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so there is the personal sickness. I don't know, again, that word. There's the individual behavioral patterning, but
Yep,
that is also by and large symptomatic of the larger cultural patterning.
exactly.
So when we're looking, and the same is true with kids and families. So often kids are, and this, when I was put in psychiatric hospitals, when I was then put in long-term inpatient, outpatient care, there's a lot of, sort of help my kids off the rails. Like
Mhm.
something's wrong with my child.
Exactly.
And what's unfortunate about that is so often that the responsibility gets placed entirely on the child, when in actuality kids, most of the vast majority of the time, they don't fly off the handle in a vacuum.
Hmm.
It is entirely related to things that are going on at home.
Environmental. Yeah,
Yeah, and that's not to say that it's somebody's fault. It's just that it's all interrelated. So now, asking these parents going, I don't know what to do. My kid's super fucked up. With any therapist, in my opinion, worth their salt is going to go, okay, well, tell me about your relationship with your parents. You
exactly.
know, and that's helpful to help us understand. But then there's also the reality of like, understanding those stories, understanding those narratives is a great jumping off point. But then we have to start to go, okay, I get it. Now what with the behaviors?
Exactly. So, how would you relate that to yourself? So, when
Mm.
you go back to like your early childhood and you were kind of, experimenting, doing a lot of different things and had, it sounds like around 10 years of exploring is what I would call it.
Yeah.
Um, and from that 10 years, you found yourself at the same time going deeper into climbing, it seemed like,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
seeing more success.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
almost like one was serving the other at the same time.
Well, one was serving the other. I think, so when I was first, so I was hospitalized when I was 13 for the first time. Um, it was directly after that I was put in this long-term inpatient outpatient care program, and I ran away from it 3 times over 8 months. And it was there that I was diagnosed with bipolar 2. I don't remember if I was 14 or 15, but it was in that time frame. That's when I completely dropped out of school.
What is the difference
Um,
between bipolar and bipolar 2? Because I don't know.
so bipolar 1 and bipolar 2. Bipolar 1 expresses with episodes of mania
Okay.
and depression. Bipolar 2 expresses with episodes of hypomania and depression.
Okay.
So hypomania is one level, I wouldn't call it below. It's a slightly different expression that doesn't break into that sort of almost psychosis realm.
Got it. Hmm.
So hypomania is actually a really, really amazing place to be. You are
Probably
capable of
very productive.
highly productive,
Yeah.
highly productive. You're still sort of online, meaning you're not doing excessively crazy shit. Your tolerance for risk is elevated, but it's not necessarily tipping into the dangerous. You are very social, enviably so. You've got big ideas. You can learn things instantly. Your retention is very high. It's a really beautiful, I mean, it feels great, right?
Yeah. Sounds
Mate
brilliant.
is great. Yeah,
Maybe I'm
in a lot of
bipolar.
people. What was that?
So maybe I'm bipolar.
Well, hey, look, we all express in on varying degrees, right?
Exactly.
And then mania, so bipolar 1 is where it tips into like, oh my God, this is where it gets manic, is where
Mm,
that term comes from. And
got
then
it.
you're doing things that are very, very irrational, outside, very compulsive, impulsive. This is getting engaged after 2 days. This is, selling the house. This is draining the bank account. This is things like, very high risk sex, drugs, all of these things. But it seems that to that person, oftentimes it's totally rational,
Mm-hmm.
right? But you can oftentimes notice it in a person because they're just talking so fast and you can't even keep up with them.
Yes.
That's mirroring what's going on inside their head.
Brain.
And
Exactly.
that mania can actually tip into to sort of a psychotic break.
Hmm.
Um, so I was diagnosed with bipolar 2. I tend to be more depressive, but my episodes, when they've come up, are generally what are called mixed episodes. So I'm either oscillating back and forth so quickly that it appears as one thing, or the depression and the hypomania are sort of overlapping, which
Mhm.
is very disorienting. So I was diagnosed 14 or 15, and then I ran away from this treatment facility for the third time, and then I was just sort of homeless for a
Mm,
while. And I wasn't often on the streets, but I was occasionally. And there's some pretty dark stories in the book about some of that.
mm.
Squatting and being in these people's houses that I didn't know who they were, and some really
Dark.
tragic stuff happened in
Yeah.
those circumstances. And it was after that that I started, I moved to Seattle, I moved to Idaho, I was bouncing around, people were sort of taking me in. And and at about 17 years old, I sort of I anchored with my aunt and uncle in Seattle, and I ended up getting some jobs and holding them down, um and saving a little bit of money. I thought I was paying my uncle rent, and he actually was saving the money for me. And he said, "Well, look, if you choose an experience, um, I'll give you this money back." And so, I'd grown up climbing, and I was still very curious about it. A piece of my identity had always been anchored there. So I asked if I could, I wanted to go on a climbing trip, and I organized it, and he gave me the money back. I put it all together, with a group of actually my dad's climbing partners, and we went to Alaska to go climbing. And it was on that trip that I asked my mom to if I could borrow her little point and shoot camera. And so that's when I fell into photography.
That's
It
what
was
I was wondering about too. It's like now you're this renowned National Geographic awarded photographer. And it just seemed again, your ability to pick up things and use your gifts so easily is it's so admirable. It's like,
well,
pretty, I mean, it's not like you have this like formal, people dream of like, where you got.
yeah, and sometimes I feel a certain element of guilt around that too,
But it's
because
the way you see. It's your gift of seeing.
yeah, thank you, thank you. I will take it. I will take it. But I think, and I think part of the way I see is built on the way I I interpreted the world in those adolescent years, or the way I was experiencing the world, because there was so much uncertainty. The way I could anchor myself, at least through photography, was trying to explore that uncertainty through art, right? And also express the discomfort, in myself. And climbing as an allegory for those things was really, really useful, right? You are willfully engaging in a deep, um, dance of struggle and suffering, and in doing so, you're stripping away a bunch of bullshit on the
Yeah,
outside.
yeah,
There's no room for vanity there
no.
in the moment. But the irony of that is, and this happened over time, is that then there was a huge amount of vanity in it for me,
Mm,
because I could build an identity as this guy,
mm.
this adventure guy. And then it was the National Geographic guy. And then, so as much as I was driving for that authenticity in the moments that photography could capture, I was really also missing the genuine authenticity of sort of taking the value in those moments and taking the information and then living in them longer and longer and
Do
longer.
you think that's sometimes what happens when you take what you're passionate about and it becomes a career?
Oh, for sure. For sure. I mean, have you experienced that? I don't
Yeah,
know.
I mean, you can't. Well, I'm not where you're at, but I mean, I don't have to actually worry about the vanity quite yet. Just kidding.
But
No, that's not true. I will say I experienced it on my own level. We
yeah.
talked about social media before you and I got on the call, right? And
Hmm.
I try to remain as authentic as possible. Like, which is why, like with the podcast, I don't overly edit. Why with, reels, I don't really care. I don't like put on a ton of makeup and try to look amazing or retouch and all that because I just feel like that's not real. And what, like we were saying, why we straddle these worlds is because people are attracted to us because we're real.
Hmm. Hmm.
And we really don't want anything from them. We are just showing up to sort of, it's like you being on the other side of the camera.
Yeah.
You're absorbing so much more than you ever let people know.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're also using that feedback, that biofeedback, that emotional feedback to then unlock a deeper sense of authenticity from your
Yeah.
subjects and the situation you're in
Yeah.
and yourself,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So, I do think that it's a part of what you were talking about, where when you start to, so there's this, it's always a yes and. That's why the book is
Totally.
called The Color of Everything, is because black and white thinking is a disservice to ourselves and everybody around us. There is no such thing as black or white in the world. Everything is a yes and. It's all shades of gray. And
I
I
agree.
have not been presented with a single circumstance that cannot be understood from a different angle.
Completely agree.
Now, I know that's challenging for some people. I'm just saying there's context to everything, which muddies the black and white. And so, and that's part of these narratives that we tell. And so it's back to this question. It's a yes and, where when I started doing this, when I started pursuing photography and I started pursuing climbing, they were very, very valuable expressions of freedom and owning and anchoring a place in the world, and having a voice and expressing the emotional this emotional um, angst inside of me. And they were such good coping tools, and they were such good modalities. And over time, um they then became something that that was maladaptive. So
Hmm.
the very thing that I was trying to avoid, or not avoid, but navigate, uh they ended up feeding into. And so
Hmm.
often I think that's the case when we're always told, find the thing you love and do it for work. Well, yes, and
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
you know what I mean? I think that also creates a very false sense of what it means to work in the world. I think that's kind of a disservice to a lot of people, especially young people.
Yeah, being able to set boundaries on stuff like that, even like I agree with you, like when you said, do you go through that? It's like even with like coaching, like I'm
Yeah,
talking to people like you and I talked about it. I'm like, when I do the podcast, it's like I'm coaching someone.
right,
I
right.
get curious and I'm like, what is that? Right.
What
And
is that about?
you can't, it's difficult sometimes, right? Like, so I was thinking also, is that one of your reasons for doing the photography book?
Ah,
That one's
you know,
called A Bipolar Mind. What is it called? I'm sorry.
the
Go ahead.
so the memoir is called The Color of Everything, and that came out first. And then just last week on October 15th, the photo book, the coffee table book, came out. It's called Bipolar, and the subtitle is Photographs from an Unquiet Mind. Um, and the idea, they are really, I always say this, they are truly an ecosystem. They're really one book split
Mm,
into two. One is the internal exploration, the other internal is the other is the external um, expression of that internal exploration. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. They're very much an ecosystem. Um, I think
I
the
think that's really cool that you have the capability that you can actually, because again, when in listening to the audible component of it, there's so much that when I've seen just on Instagram, because I haven't got the other book yet, but I'm like, oh, I wonder if that's that man that he saw, you know?
yeah, yeah.
So I feel like it's like it makes it come to life.
Well, and I want it to be more dimensional.
Mhm. Perfect.
That's one of these gifts that I am so fortunate to have, is I have pictures to document the entire thing.
Yeah.
Right. And so, but the photo book, I didn't start with the photo book in mind. I think a lot of people assume sort of, oh, you were going to do a photo book and then you start. actually it was the exact opposite. COVID happened. I was training to do a new route, something that had
Mhm.
never ever been climbed by anyone on Everest, on the northeast face of Everest,
Oh, is
in
that all?
2019. And COVID happened. We tried it in 2019. We were training. The Everest season got canceled in 2021. It got canceled again from the Tibetan side, or in 20, and then again in 2021. So we went to um, the seventh highest mountain in the world called Dhaulagiri to try to do again a new route, sort of as a training run for Everest. And it was there at base camp that I had the most pronounced mixed bipolar episode that I've had in my adult life.
Mhm.
And on the heels of that, it was when I was like, something in this life is no longer working. This
Mhm.
idea of this grand big adventure life of me taking photos and gallivanting and climbing mountains, it was all true, but it was also had become so destructive internally that I was sort of forced into a confrontation with this idea that this really wasn't working for me anymore. And it
Mhm.
was then that I left climbing and photography, and I was like, I didn't really know what I was going to do. I moved to LA, and I just started writing. And so the memoir came first, and then once that sold to Random House, um 10 Speed Press, who published the photo book, was like, hey, we want to do sort of a companion book, that stands alone.
Why didn't you
But
stay with Random House for both?
well, 10 Speed Press is a Random House
Oh, it's like
imprint.
a, okay, got it.
Yeah. So I did. So, but and then doing both books at once was an incredible exercise, in just like managing workload, because as anybody who's written a book will tell you, like, two books at one time is kind of fucked up. But also, I think it was really, really beneficial because by looking at the photographs and sort of digging through that, I was able in some ways to connect
The two of
to
them.
yeah, I was able to connect the two of them. And I didn't think they were going to be the same thing, they're like two
Mhm.
sides of the same coin, but then they were.
Hmm. Yeah,
So
well, I mean, I think it's like sometimes, again, it goes back, you're an experiential learner. It
mhm.
goes into this whole component of while you're in it, you're defining.
Right,
And
right.
so, like, you're writing the book, and then you're like, oh, wow, let me take a look at that picture. And what was I really going through at that point in time? And, I
Yes.
could see, I could see the reflection that must have been going on for you during that time as you were writing and sort of remembering, because these are very these moments are so wrought with such raw emotion of death
Yeah.
and life and all experiences in one.
Yeah. I mean, for better and worse, right? Like, I think there's there's a degree, and I'll say this, and I'm not trying to get down on myself. There's an absolutely an exploitative quality to, I think, to all photography, but certainly to mine, where I was almost using the world around me as an avatar to try to understand myself.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's natural. I think that's so often what art actually is. But when there is a degree, there is a place where it becomes more exploitative than it is giving, than it is generative. So um, I'm not saying that I think anybody else around me felt that, but certainly there was an internal struggle where I I questioned, people so often would be like, oh, when you're doing conservation work or you're telling these big stories, and you're the photographs are actually changing legislation and things like that, getting areas protected. It's very easy to be like, yeah, I'm changing policy, and hiding behind it, and being like, yeah, no, it's all for other people. For me, that was ever totally honest. I was like, well, I'm really mostly doing this for myself.
Mm-hmm.
And and the more sort of accolades that were lauded on me, like around it, the more almost inauthentic it all felt.
Exactly.
And yeah, so it's
Is
interesting,
that
but it,
is part of that? Do you struggle with actually seeing yourself? Like, meaning, like,
mm,
that you are actually making that impact? It's like a worth thing.
mm, yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really good question.
Yeah.
It's a beaut.
It goes back to your answer. Yes. And
Yes. Yeah, yes, and you're absolutely
exactly.
right. And that's very, very insightful. I
Yeah.
think, go ahead.
Because you clearly are making an impact, but then because you feel like you're on the peripheral of it.
Right. So, well, two things that you just said. There's always a sense, and this seems to be consistent. I mean, really throughout humanity, but certainly there's an amplified sense of being on the outside looking in when you look at like the addiction communities and the mental health communities. There's this profound sense of being on the outside, as if you're looking at a world you can see but never touch.
Mm,
And so photography, art was very much a way to tether myself to that world. But at the same time, it still felt very much outside of me. And I also think that when it comes back to narratives and stories around mental health, part of this idea of brokenness and part of the idea, sort of the story of broken, or a component that the story of broken has, is a lack of value or worthiness.
mm,
And so that's sort of baked into that idea of brokenness,
mm,
right? So I have a very hard time still, and I'm 43 now, um, and I've done it fucking every kind of therapy you can, um, with love and sometimes with hate. But I still have a hard time extending myself the value, um, or the worth that I still have a hard time seeing myself in those ways at times.
mm.
It's
Do you think that's why you always strived for more? Going back to, like, being bipolar and bipolar two, going back to that, like, we talked a little bit when we met about the desire to constantly strive for more,
mhm,
and where is it enough? And enough and
mhm,
worthiness kind of go hand in hand.
mhm. Well, I think that's part of it. I think part of it was, with photography especially, there was this idea that I could I could clearly make a statement through a photograph, especially in like a physical print form, that somehow I mattered. I was like making a statement in the world that I was here,
It was a
that that
physical.
that's physically anchored my value
I get it.
to to the world, right? And so
Versus a
uh
physical person is different.
exactly
Not a
right,
you. Yes, okay, they say you are your product, but technically it's not physical, like something that somebody can buy. They can
right,
have the experience of working with you, but not a
exactly.
physical product. Yeah.
And those things are very ethereal, right? So it's harder to apply value to them or to see them as valuable, whereas a physical object actually has some inherent value to it, even though I would argue that the inherent value of humanity is so much beyond, obviously so much beyond that. But so to answer your question, I think there's absolutely an element of um I was absolutely trying to anchor myself externally to something of value,
Hmm.
right? Um, and striving was part and parcel of that. That the more I could, the more output I could have, and the more I could anchor myself to in the physical world, um, and not just physical objects, but notoriety and whatnot, then obviously the more value I would have. But I've also talked a lot about mistaking attention for love,
Mm,
and or mistaking attention for value. So,
mm,
the little
mm.
thumbs up on your Facebook or your whatever app you're using,
Yeah,
Facebook,
like,
I don't even use that, but you know what I mean? The heart, there's sort of this mistake that when you get these likes and somehow that means there's value. Well, there is actual monetary value in the influencing world, but at the end of the day, there's actually no real um, human value to it.
Mhm.
Uh, there's
Well,
economic value.
the
So
statement is that the more, the more ability we have to connect, the less we truly are connected, meaning through social zones, right? So
right, and
when we misuse them, we're truly not connected, right? And
or
as you said, like, you don't love social media. Like, and the reason why that I could say to you that it's so funny, of course, because I see people and I read them, but like, I was like, this guy hates doing these videos.
yeah, maybe that's why I'm losing followers.
I think I need to
Um,
coach you through them. Just you're not losing followers. There's no way.
Well, it's funny because it's this give and take. It's this push and pull. And so this idea that external value comes through, you know, um, proving that you have a place in the world is deeply flawed, right? And I think that for me has been the biggest healing process is peeling that back and realizing that you know, I don't have to always be making. I don't have to always be creating. I don't have to strive for more, 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 more. If I want to do that, simply for the expression of creating, which I think is such a beautiful thing.
Totally.
Create to for creation's sake. That is beautiful. To create for the sake of proving worth or value, that is flawed. I mean,
Absolutely.
the greatest gift, sometimes I wander around and I just look. I've changed my perspective has changed so much in the past few years since writing and doing this stuff. But like my hat, I'm wearing a hat that says "Holy shit, we're alive." Um,
I love that hat. Where'd you get that at?
it's a great little company. You can just order the hats. They're awesome. They're
What's the
they're
name of the
like
company? Oh, you're gonna have to tell me.
holy shit, we're alive.
Oh, really? Oh, that's so
Yeah,
funny. Okay.
yeah. But I the privilege to create. And
Mm,
what I mean by create is not just art or making these big things in the world, but like literally our consciousness, our experience of humanity is an ongoing process of creating. We
hmm.
create situations, we create relationships, we create art, we create food, we create the
And
whole
through our consciousness.
that's it. The whole process of this experience is creativity. It's
Mm,
creation.
mm,
And we don't have to do the bigger, better, faster, more to be in a constant process of creation and creativity. That is our prerogative as humans. And that in and of itself is enough.
and I think you're absolutely right. This goes back to
Right.
the
Exactly.
conditioning and the patterning that we have to break to believe that we are enough simply by being.
Simply by waking up and breathing, you are enough. You are enough. Enough is possible.
Mm,
Enough simply is. You already are it. But LA, and we've talked about this, LA, Hollywood, the entertainment industry, money, the sort of the patriarchal capitalistic system that we live in. And we can get into a whole other conversation about that. I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying all of this tells us that our value is in um, amassing and amassing wealth,
totally.
specifically as men,
Oh, yeah.
and then being sex, specifically as women,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And so it's like, and when you get reduced that far, then the reflex expression of that is, well, I'm going to have to get the sexy partner. And on the other side, and this is
Yeah.
heteronormative relationships, I'm just saying in general. And then on the other side is I'm gonna look, and sex myself up to get the
This.
partner who's amassed it all. Thinking somewhat, we know that that doesn't make us happy,
Exactly.
but we do it anyway,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah. And And yet, I always think that if you remove yourself from the dynamic and you seek your own dynamic, because
Hmm.
but that requires an extreme amount of discipline,
Hmm.
um, that you can then align with what you want. And that actually goes into not just relationships, that's like your job, that's all of it. But we are
Yeah.
constantly butting up against, like, is this what I want? Is this what I want? But this is what human conditioning tells me.
Well, is this what I want? And then is what I want enough in the cultural context in which I live? Am
Yes,
I okay not being famous?
yes,
And I'm saying that with tongue in cheek, but seriously,
yeah.
in this town,
Mm-hmm.
am I okay just being a regular person?
Mm-hmm.
Fuck. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, 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 yes.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Well, and I
I
think that that's it. Like it's like, yeah, it's constant self-reflection
yeah.
and reminding yourself of what you're showing up here to do, whatever that is, you
And, and
know.
I and I think giving, I have I sort of have a list of things that I like to hit throughout the day. And there's 8 pillars, and I'm toying with writing around about them. I don't necessarily want to do the 8 pillars of success. Like I'm
Exactly.
sort of tapped out on those books, but one of the pillars that I
And by the
really,
way, you would never write a book like that.
I, if I did, it would be a totally different take on it.
You'd be like, oh my
It-
God, like I can't write that. That's exactly what you'd be telling the publisher.
exactly. And yet so many people are like, you should write that. And I'm like,
Oh, trust
well,
me. Like this is exactly the reason why I have been torn about these books because I'm like, I know that one's marketable. I don't want that one. I like this one. It's way more interesting.
and fucking follow that, man. Follow that because that's where interesting work is made.
Hmm.
But what I was going to say is one of those pillars, if I want to call them that, one of those things is giving.
Hmm.
And so there's the constant self work and looking at yourself and being honest with yourself. And that there's also an irony to just allowing yourself to be yourself and not always having to work, but that's sort of another point altogether. But then really getting outside of yourself and giving as much as you can. And that's something that I've really focused on doing over the past 3 years in this sort of transformation that I've gone through writing the books is getting outside of myself. Because it's very easy to get sort of pathologically self-obsessed because our culture is telling us to do that too. We live in a selfie culture. I think the antidote to that, and the balance to that deep introspection in a healthy way is giving.
I agree with you.
And we also know that giving is and generosity is deeply tied to what people, what we talk about as happiness, um,
Hmm.
not amassing more wealth.
Yes, exactly. Well, I think like the thing is, the more we give, the more you get, right? It's
Hmm.
the old age saying. And I think I was writing with a colleague last night and she was talking about not knowing where this was going, this thing that she was investing in. And I said, that is the gift, is the
Hmm.
not knowing, because the more you give to that, you're going to receive. Just follow it,
Yeah.
because through following it, that's where the answers come. But we always want to know. We need to know, like, what am I going to get from it? What's in it for me? Which,
Yeah. We have to have uncertainty to have certainty.
mm-hmm,
They rely on each other. We have to have fear to understand hope.
mm-hmm,
This is sort of my the photo book plays with these ideas. It's organized into emotional polarities. And the idea being that all of these dualities are what give the other meaning. They give their opposites meaning. And leaning into uncertainty is an incredibly hard thing to do. I mean, I'm very much outwardly, we talked about this on social media. It's like, oh, you're on Good Morning America. It's Anderson Cooper, and you're doing like people go, well, what are you doing? And behind the curtain,
mm-hmm,
behind the social media curtain, I'm like, shit, I don't know what I'm doing.
mm-hmm.
Like the books are done.
Yeah.
I can't just keep talking about books forever. I can't just keep doing podcasts forever.
Mm-hmm.
that's, I have no interest in that.
Yes.
And
That's not where your heart is.
exactly.
Yes.
So it's like I'm very much in that moment of deep, deep, deep uncertainty. And man, is it, oh my God, it's like having it's like having, body aches, where
Hmm.
it's just
I was
that
gonna
kind
say
of
it's a
that,
little bit like having like bugs all over your body, and it's like
yeah,
you're constantly being touched. It's your
yeah,
mind touching you, right? That
yeah.
you're in this introspection, and yet all you want is a bit of clarity, I'm
All
sure.
you want is clarity. Is it going to be okay? Is it good?
Mhm,
Like, what's going to happen next? And
mhm.
my girlfriend and I talk about this all the time, and we know that we are in a very privileged situation. And period. Sorry, we
And dot
know that we're in a very
dot.
privileged situation, and I do believe that this extends to everybody. Most of us at any given moment have enough.
Hmm.
We have enough to survive.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying everybody does. I know there are exceptions to this. And I am not trying to speak out of turn here. I understand my privilege. I understand where I was born, the body I was born into. I get it. What I'm saying is, at the moment to moment level, the greatest reset I've ever, the greatest reframe I've ever encountered is the acknowledgement that, holy shit, I have a body that is breathing and living. And so
Mm.
long as I have that, I'm actually mostly okay. I might not like what's going on around me,
Yes,
but so long as I'm in this situation, I am by and large okay.
absolutely.
And this, I think this extends so much deeper than people really think, because immediately our thing is, well, there's war and there's this, there's terrible things that, yes, those are all terrible things. I'm not saying they're not. I'm not saying people aren't victims of them. I'm not saying any of that. I'm saying underlying that all is the basic premise that we are alive. And so long as we are alive, there is the potential for a future, and that future is underwritten by the fact that we are breathing and we're inhabiting a body. And the more I can default back to that in both the marvelous and the completely horrific experiences in my life, the more level I am, where I'm just
Mhm.
like, you know,
Well, when we're alive, we have choice.
exactly. We have
And
agency.
yes,
Yeah.
and that is the perspective of someone who can create change and innovation and uh, inspire others, right? And the thing is that most people don't realize they have choice. So
Mm-hmm.
even if you have so little, you
Mm-hmm.
still have choice. And like you said, we're both super fortunate
Mm-hmm.
and we're super grateful at the same time.
Yeah.
But we
And it's,
also recognize that we can shift our
I
reality.
mean, we can. And the idea of the conversation around privilege is that for people in our position, the shift and the change comes probably easier because we have access to things, right? And
Hmm.
we have access
Absolutely.
to different environments. And that's the reality of privilege. Um, but it is accessible to everybody.
Absolutely.
And again, I'm not taking away from people's specific
No, but I think what
circumstances.
you're mentioning about the uncertainty, which is where we started the conversation before we started recording, is we're actually mirrors of one another. No
Hmm.
matter where we are, there might be a different set of circumstances. But in that moment, when you described your uncertainty and the way that you were feeling about your own dynamic and situation, and me knowing and knowing how successful you are, right? I was like, well, that makes me feel normal because
Yeah,
I'm going through the same thing on a
totally.
different level. And we know that if we have this same conversation with someone else, and it doesn't have to be the dynamics of what we were discussing, what it is, it goes back to being present with someone
Hmm. Yeah.
and
It's
listening and feeling into them and wanting to know their story.
two ears, one mouth, two
Hmm.
eyes, one mouth. You know, it's really about curiosity and you being curious about ourselves, but being curious about others gives us more information about ourselves. To your point of being reflections, and the way I said that in the because there's a moment in the book where I talk about exactly this thing where we're just reflecting each other. There's a great quote that says, the only thing you can photograph is light reflecting off of things.
Yes.
And, and then the way I frame that is like we're a daisy chain of 8 billion reflections.
Mm.
And the more curious we get about others, the more we learn about ourselves.
Oh my God. I so agree with you. Uh, yeah, that's why this podcast is such a gift, is
Yeah.
because every single time I'm like, oh, wow, we're a lot more alike than I thought. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
But I actually think it's about attraction. I
Yeah.
think it's about like what you call into your circle and your vortex and the going back to the curiosity, it's the listening of the learning of like, okay, thank you, Cory.
Yeah.
I heard
Yeah.
that. Okay, I'm going to go give something today. Even when I'm busy, I will make sure to give, you know? And so, yeah, anyways, this was an amazing conversation. And clearly we could talk forever.
I love it.
I do too. I do. I'm super grateful for you. You know that.
Thank you.
I have a few other questions for you. My first question is about what makes you feel alive?
Hmm.
Because you're wearing the hat. We have a whole discussion about it. And I have been reflecting myself because my birthday was a couple of weeks ago. And
Oh, happy
people,
birthday.
thank you. People have been saying to me, you know, Michelle, you just want people to be on your journey. Like you want everybody to feel alive. And so it's
Yeah.
really been on my mind because it wasn't just one person, it was many. And the truth is, yes, I do. But what makes you come alive?
Well, being with people I love, surrounding myself with people that I love and who make me curious and challenge me, that makes me feel very alive. Conversations like this make me feel
Mhm.
very, very alive. Um, and then on a very basic daily level, I think being outside, and I've spent a lot of my life in very extreme outdoor environments.
Yeah.
But I am astonished how accessible this overwhelming sense of awe and wonder is by simply stepping outside and looking around and focusing, like sometimes I just wander around and I'm like, holy shit, like I am in a cascade of atoms just
Mhm.
careening over themselves and vibrating at different speeds, and it's created this thing around me, and like I can literally close my eyes and just imagine, it's really too big to take on, but just imagine I am standing on a rock spaceship
Oh, I do this
with
all the time.
literally limitless, like infinite space stretching into nothingness on all sides of me.
Absolutely.
And I'm going 60,000 miles an hour around the sun. I'm spinning 1,000 miles an hour on an axis. It is mind blowing how special this is. And that makes me feel alive.
Hmm. Yeah, because you're taking advantage of it, meaning like there's sheer recognition that you're actually aware that you're doing that is being alive, right?
That's it. That is
And
living.
true, true, exactly.
And
Living,
giving makes me feel alive too.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, for sure. Well, the other thing is you touch a little bit on it when you're talking about not really knowing what was next. And
Hmm.
the curiosity that came up for me was, when you were sitting in the tent and you basically had, you know, they had invested millions of dollars on this expedition and you had to let people down, right?
Hmm.
You had to literally own that that was just not going to be possible for you.
Hmm.
At that point in time, you really didn't know what was next either.
Mm-mm. Mm.
So they're really not synonymous. They actually are part of the integration that you're talking about.
Well, I think really they've been part of the same process. That was jumping off, and then there that was the jumping off point into sort of the reinvention and the reimagining of what my life can look like. And and then there were the books, and then I sort of anchored, well, that's what I'm doing for now. I'm
Mhm.
building this. This is what I'm creating right now. And I'm creating a new community. I'm creating relationships. I have those relationships in place. I've created the books. And so there's this curiosity about what comes next. And it's like we talked about, it's very, very uncomfortable. But I think really what I'm understanding too is that we are, as creators, and I mean that as humans, we are constantly in a place of uncertainty. We just find things to anchor ourselves to.
Totally.
And so there's a deep sense of, or there's a reminder in my life to just embrace the mystery and that I don't have to figure it all out because this is
We'll have to know.
very, very mysterious the way stuff works.
Yeah, we don't have to
Timing,
know.
all of it.
Well, it's
And
interesting. Something came up for me when we met, and after this interview, it's coming up for me again. And we haven't talked about this, but in your gift of being able to reach people through mental health and wellness and in your own journey, and given the industries that you worked in that were very male driven, frankly,
mhm,
and the lack of most men actually don't address these things on the
mhm.
level that you are. I invite you to have an inquiry around that
I love it.
because I think there's something greater there about specifically touching men. But how you bring in the integration in the same way that you're talking about these shards,
Mhm.
it's the integration of women with that.
Yeah.
And that was
Um,
actually what we talked about that day when we sat together.
yeah,
There's something there for you.
there is. And I know there is, and that's come up before. And so again, this is where I get to thank you so much, not just for the conversation and this friendship and our relationship, but thank you for reminding me of that
Mhm.
because there are these themes that keep coming up. And I think that's back to this idea of what to do. How do you know what to do next? And how do you sit in that uncertainty as you get curious and you see what's coming up, what keeps presenting itself? Like, what are the things that people keep saying? And so I just had a moment of that. So thank
Yeah,
you
yeah,
for
I
that.
definitely think that things come in numbers,
Yeah.
and you're super curious. It came up for me when we met because I was like, this is rare. I'll wait till I talk to him the second time. I don't want him to think I'm weird. No, I'm just kidding.
We're all weird. I love your weird.
I love it. So, anyways, I really, really am grateful for our time together. And I am willing to 150% explore that idea with you. And I look forward to following your journey and seeing you create just more amazingly inspiring things for people to follow because, I mean, you're a gift.
Oh, you're a gift. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the gift of you. I appreciate it. And thank you for the gift of this conversation. I know it was mostly me talking, but I guess that's a podcast
Yeah, it is.
sometimes,
It's a
right? So,
podcast. I love it. No, we were
yeah.
we were talking together. When you actually listen to it, you'll realize that we were talking a lot together. But anyways, I always leave my viewers and listeners with one question, which is, what are your top 5 core values and how do they serve you every day?
Mm. Wow. God, I wish um, my core values, I would say a number one is integrity. And what I mean by that is aligning actions with what your purpose is. And I don't mean purpose like I make stuff, like your purpose,
Mhm.
what it is that,
What's your soul come here to do?
yeah, what did your soul come here to do? So aligning your actions with that. So I'd say that's number one. Um, I value the power of community, which is
Mhm.
why I engage with it so much. Specifically, I work very hard on my men's community here because I think that men need men, and I
Yes.
think that women need healthy men.
Yes, I
And,
so agree with you.
you know, we all need healthy men. So community, um, creativity.
Hmm.
Um, I think, like we talked about a little bit, aligning yourself around your unique creativity, and that doesn't have to mean art in the traditional context, but just so integrity, community, creativity. Um, I think compassion.
Hmm.
Um, People who extend themselves compassionately, uh, always. Uh, and look for the yes and in the world and step outside of the hard binaries and dualities of black and white. That is an act of compassion. And so I think I look for that and I think curiosity. So I think I just said four C's, one
Hmm.
I and
We
four
have a lot of
C's.
values in common. It's very
Yeah.
interesting. Well, it's not by surprise that we would attract one another, but we have a lot of the same values in common. So that is interesting. And I also, what is this men's community you're talking about?
Oh, um, so really quickly, when I moved here, I didn't know anybody, and I landed at a gym that was owned by a guy who his name's Kenny Kane, and um, over the year, well, when I moved here, we started sort of having more of a men's community, a small group of men that would meet, and then we started putting some structure around it, and in the years since then, we've created an ongoing men's group, but it's like men's work, but it's community building. And at this point, it's still very small. It's a group of about, I'd say, um, you know, 30 core people, 50 sort of adjacent,
Mhm.
where we're learning how to structure these things, and we're really leaning into learning new tools and engaging with new and different ideas about how to grow a healthy community that fosters and develops healthy men and masculinity in a very
Men.
confusing time for men.
Yes, very confusing. I think I know, only 2% of women get funded in their businesses, blah, blah, blah. However, which is true, and
Hmm.
I'm all about obviously supporting women. But I do believe it is a very confusing time for men and their masculinity beyond sexuality and intimacy. Um, we're talking even financial intimacy or who they are. I don't think they were ever
Totally.
really given a choice or taught that. And, those are some very important things, which is why for me with like breath work, I'm like, I need more men to facilitate in breath work because every time I have men in there, you just see they have so much to release that they don't let go of. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
hard.
And to the point about 2% of women getting funded, healthier
I'll come
men,
to you now, but yeah,
healthier men mean more women getting funded.
exactly. Exactly. This is true.
Be, because we're not stuck in a patriarchal paradigm. I know the words patriarchy is probably it's problematic for some people, so that's a different podcast that we can do another time. But
That's part two.
when we break out of that and we start to break down those hard confines of the patriarchal structure that encourages men to feed into other men, and starts being more expansive, that means more women get funded.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So,
Or
yeah,
their relation to what it means to fund a woman also.
that's the whole thing.
The trust in that, right?
Yeah,
Right.
that's why, you reframe all of this stuff, and all of a sudden that whole trust, whatever it happens to be, whatever the sticking point is,
Mhm.
starts to get shifted. And then so that the funding also, and that's just one thing.
Well, it's
I mean,
all interconnected. It's all like pillars of intimacy.
I love that. I
Financial
love the way of
intimacy is
framing
one
that.
of them. So,
But the other weird thing about this that is so funny, and maybe it's a cliffhanger for our next conversation, but It's also curious to think of the rewards of patriarchy
Mm,
being wealth and power. If
yeah.
they are so rewarding, why are men so sick
Yeah. And broken, going back
and
to
broken? So is that really a system we want to copy?
no.
No. So again, it's a bigger question,
It's all
you
just
know?
symptomatic of more mental health and wellness that we need to work on. Oh,
Exactly.
all right.
Exactly.
Well, I think
All
you're right.
right.
It's a cliffhanger for next time. And again,
Yeah.
just thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to more interactions and our next coffee date.
I love it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.